Dawn over Midway, the calm before the storm. June 4th, 1942. Pre-dawn mist clung to the waters of the Pacific just north of Midway Atoll. The horizon was a delicate smear of pink and gray, the sea whispering beneath the faint rumble of distant engines. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida, a young but battle-hardened Japanese carrier pilot, stood on the deck of Akagi, his flight suit damp from the salty spray of the ocean. His hands, gloved and steady, gripped the edges of his cockpit as he watched the first streaks of sunlight glint across the carrier deck. The air smelled of fuel, oil, and the faint tang of smoke from the ship's boilers. Around him, the hum of activity was relentless. Gunners checking their 25mm anti-aircraft cannons, flight officers signaling crews with brisk practice gestures, and the occasional shout of a sailor warning of a dropped wrench or loose harness. The vast flight deck seemed to vibrate under the energy of preparation, as if the steel itself anticipated the coming clash. Fuchida's squadron, the B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, waited in formation. Their polished fuselages reflected the pale light of dawn, and the propeller's gentle rotation cut through the stillness with a whisper that hinted at the chaos to come. Mitsuo's eyes scanned the horizon, where the distant shapes of other Japanese carriers, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū lay anchored in the morning haze. Each ship was a fortress, a floating city of men, machines, and meticulously orchestrated schedules. And yet, beneath this disciplined calm, there was an unspoken tension, the knowledge that the enemy was near, hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. Fuchida adjusted his goggles and tightened his grip on the control stick. He could hear the soft murmur of radios, the rustle of papers, and the distant thrum of engines warming up. The deck crew moved with precision, but he sensed their underlying unease. Rumors of American forces had been circulating, reports of carriers spotted near the atoll, of reconnaissance planes shot down, of strange movements in the sky. Each pilot knew that today could mark the turning point of the war in the Pacific, though none could foresee exactly how. Below the deck, the engine rooms rumbled like great mechanical hearts, pumping life into these massive vessels. Fuchida took a deep breath and felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. The last time he had flown over an enemy fleet, the taste of victory had been bittersweet, triumph overshadowed by the loss of comrades. Today, however, there was no room for doubt. Orders had come down from Admiral Yamamoto himself. Destroy the American carriers, seize the initiative, crush the fleet before it can strike again. As the sun lifted higher, painting the water with streaks of gold, Fuchida climbed into the cockpit. The metal was cool beneath his hands, the gauges and instruments flickering to light. He could feel the tremor of anticipation ripple through the aircraft, and through him, around him, the carriers were alive with motion. Deck crews signaling, torpedoes being loaded, and planes taxiing into position. Every sound, every motion, every glance carried the unspoken weight of war. Mitsuo Fuchida exhaled slowly, feeling the vibration of the Nakajima B-5N engine beneath him. Today, he thought, would be the day that defined the fate of the Pacific. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, American pilots were taking off, unaware that the eyes of Japan were already fixed upon them. And yet, deep in his chest, a flicker of unease stirred, a whisper that history sometimes moved in ways even the most disciplined minds could not predict. Then, without warning, the first Japanese aircraft lifted into the morning sky, slicing through the mist like silver knives. Fuchida followed, the wind rushing past his face, the deck of Akagi shrinking beneath him. The carrier fleet behind him glittered in the dawn, a fortress of steel and firepower, unaware that within hours, the sea around them would erupt in flames, and the fate of the Japanese Empire would pivot on a single, devastating moment. Section 2. The First Strike, Into the Inferno, June 4, 1942, 7:15. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida gripped the control stick of his B-5N Kate, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun, reflecting off the endless Pacific. Below him, the Akagi and her sister carriers churned the water into white froth, their decks now cleared for the mission that would define the day. The hum of engines filled the air, a mechanical heartbeat racing in tandem with the pilot's own adrenaline. Fuchida's squadron formed up, slicing through the low morning clouds like silver arrows. The ocean below was calm, a deceptive tranquility that belied the maelstrom about to erupt. Over the radio, commands crackled with precise urgency. Target confirmed. Approach. Vector 6-4. Torpedoes armed. Maintain altitude. Strike now. Each word was clipped, efficient, but it carried the weight of inevitability. The Americans, hidden somewhere to the north, were unaware of the storm descending upon them, but they would soon learn. Minutes stretched like hours as the squadron approached. Then, suddenly, the horizon erupted with explosions. Anti-aircraft fire from the U.S. carriers. Flak shredded the sky in blooming clouds of white and black. Fuchida's stomach clenched as shells whistled past, and he instinctively ducked, guiding his plane through a web of smoke and fire. Beside him, a fellow pilot's plane shuddered violently before spiraling down into the sea, leaving a plume of black smoke in its wake. The first death of the morning was swift and cruel, a reminder that every man in this formation was already flirting with oblivion. Fuchida tightened his grip, heart pounding as he lined up for the attack. The B-5N was a sturdy aircraft, nimble despite its size, but it felt like carrying the weight of Japan itself on its wings. He released the torpedo, watching it plunge into the dark water below, a small missile of destruction aimed at an unseen enemy. Moments later, one of the torpedoes hit home. Water erupted against the hull of an American carrier, the shockwave rocking the surrounding ships. Smoke and fire began to twist into the sky, and Fuchida's breath caught in his throat. The initial strike was a success, but it was only the beginning. Through the chaos, he glimpsed the USS Yorktown, a massive vessel bristling with guns, fighting desperately to repel the Japanese assault. Flames licked at her deck, sailors scrambling to contain the inferno. Fuchida felt a pang of awe, mixed with fear. He had seen destruction before, but the scale here, the precision and violence was staggering. Each explosion illuminated the pilots' faces in fleeting, ghostly moments, revealing a mixture of terror, determination, and disbelief. Yet, amidst the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. Fuchida began to understand the stakes in a way that was almost cinematic, almost surreal. This wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a battle for the future of the entire Pacific. One misstep could doom his squadron. One successful strike could shift the balance of power. He could see the patterns of American defensive maneuvers, anticipate their flak bursts, and feel the pulse of the fight as if it were an extension of his own body. Then came the unmistakable sound of a carrier's heart giving way, a deep, rolling explosion from below, followed by a towering column of fire and smoke. One of the Japanese reconnaissance planes had radioed back. The USS Yorktown was critically damaged. Fuchida's stomach twisted. For the first time, the reality of war became intimate, personal. Each burst of fire wasn't just a statistic. It was a life extinguished, a career ended, a family shattered. And yet, in the pilot's mind, there was no room for hesitation. Survival and the mission demanded singular focus. As the squadron circled back to regroup, Fuchida's eyes caught the faint glimmer of another target, the USS Enterprise, still intact, still fighting. The American fleet had more carriers than they had anticipated. The battle was escalating, and the Japanese strike force was now fully committed. Smoke from previous hits hung in the sky like a shroud, the Pacific reflecting it in waves of gray and orange. Fuchida realized that this was more than a fight.
It was a test of nerve, skill, and endurance. The outcome would ripple far beyond this morning, shaping the course of a war that spanned thousands of miles. Amidst the roar of engines and the crack of distant gunfire, Mitsuo Fuchida felt the first seed of doubt. Even as the Japanese carriers continued to launch attack after attack, he sensed an underlying fragility, a fleeting, almost imperceptible warning that victory was never guaranteed. The war, he would soon understand, was beginning to pivot, and the events unfolding over Midway would etch themselves into the memory of every pilot, sailor, and soldier who witnessed them.
Section 3. The Turning Tide. Catastrophe strikes the Japanese fleet. June 4th, 1942, 10:30. The Japanese carriers were alive with activity, but the mood aboard was shifting. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida, now circling high above the chaos in his B-5N Kate, had the first eerie sense that fortune might be slipping through their fingers. Smoke rose from the American carriers like black banners of defiance, and for the first time Fuchida realized how fragile even the most disciplined fleet could be under fire. From his vantage point, he could see Akagi and Kaga maneuvering to launch additional waves of planes. The decks were packed with aircraft, each awaiting orders for the next strike. Below, deck crews moved frantically, torpedoes being shifted into position, bombs checked and rechecked, sailors shouting over the roar of engines. Mitsuo felt the tension in the air, the strain of men and metal pushed to the limit. He knew that every second counted. The Americans were not only resisting, they were adapting. Then the unthinkable happened. Reports crackled over the radio. Kaga had been hit. Flames licked the superstructure. Explosions ripped through the flight deck, and smoke curled into the sky like a dark crown. Mitsuo's stomach sank. He knew this ship intimately. Its decks he had walked, the planes he had launched, but now it was aflame, mortally wounded. The reality hit hard. The carriers that had seemed invincible, symbols of Japanese naval power, were suddenly vulnerable, destructible. Moments later, Sōryū and Akagi joined the inferno. Fire spread across decks, bombs detonated in violent bursts, and the carriers shuddered as if they were living beings in pain. Mitsuo could see sailors leaping into the ocean, the sea erupting around them with the desperate hope of survival. The scene was apocalyptic, metal twisting, paint blistering, smoke thick enough to blot out the sun. Fuchida's ears rang from the explosions, and his eyes burned from the acrid smoke. For the first time, the unshakable confidence he had felt that morning began to crumble. He banked his plane sharply, trying to regroup with the surviving squadron members, but the sky was a chaotic lattice of smoke, fire, and falling debris. Communications were frenzied, orders shouted, radios crackling, pilots calling for coordination that was now almost impossible to maintain. The Japanese fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific with unchallenged authority, was now in disarray, a fleet of ghosts barely holding its cohesion. Fuchida felt a knot tighten in his chest. He could see the human cost in real time, the sailors struggling against flames, the pilots diving to avoid anti-aircraft fire, the deck crew's frantic efforts to save what could not be saved. Even as the Japanese launched counterstrikes, their planes were increasingly vulnerable, targeted by American pilots who had learned quickly from each encounter. Every calculated movement was met with a brutal, lethal reaction. Amid the chaos, a heavy realization settled over Fuchida. He had trained for battles, for torpedo runs, for dogfights, but he had not trained for the collapse of an entire armada beneath his eyes. The weight of history pressed down on him, and a chilling thought formed. This might not just be a battle lost, but a turning point in the entire war. And then, from the deck of Hiryū, Fuchida witnessed the last flicker of hope for his side. Hiryū, the final undamaged carrier, was launching a desperate counterattack. Smoke and flame from the stricken Akagi and Kaga cast an ominous glow across the water, but planes surged forward anyway, engines screaming, bombs poised to strike the enemy. Mitsuo could see the determination etched on their faces, a mixture of courage, fear, and resignation. It was a valiant effort, but against the unfolding reality, it seemed almost futile. High above the water, Mitsuo realized that in those fleeting moments, everything had changed. The Japanese fleet, once the unstoppable juggernaut of the Pacific, had shown cracks that could not be ignored, and as he glanced toward the horizon, he glimpsed the first signs of American air power regrouping, planes rising from smoke-covered decks, ready to strike back. The pivot of fate was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Midway was no longer just a battle, it was the moment the war's balance had begun to shift. Section 4. Fire and Smoke. The fall of Hiryū. Hiryū, the last remaining Japanese carrier in the battle, moved like a wounded predator, its deck a frenzy of motion. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida, circling above in his B-5N Kate, could see the frantic activity of the crew below. Deck officers, signaling launch sequences, pilots sprinting to their planes, torpedoes being loaded as quickly as humanly possible. Every second was critical, every delay could cost them the fight. Fuchida's squadron, battered but still airborne, received orders to strike the American carriers once more. Smoke from Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū swirled into a thick, suffocating blanket over the fleet, mingling with the scent of burning fuel and molten metal. Fuchida could see the deck crews below, their uniforms charred and faces streaked with soot, yet they worked with mechanical precision, driven by duty even as the fire threatened to consume them. Then came the reconnaissance reports that chilled every pilot's heart. Enemy dive bombers had located Hiryū. From his high vantage, Fuchida watched as American SBD Dauntlesses plunged from the sky like hunting hawks. The first bombs struck with deadly precision, tearing through the flight deck, igniting fuel stores and sending men and equipment tumbling into the flames. Explosions ripped through the carrier in a staccato rhythm, shaking the steel frame and hurling fire into the sky. Fuchida felt a cold shock run down his spine. Hiryū had been the last hope of the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway, and now it was under relentless assault. Smoke thickened, turning morning into an infernal dust. The roar of engines and the crack of anti-aircraft fire were almost lost beneath the sound of the explosions, each one echoing like the drumbeat of doom. He could see the deck bending, the hangars collapsing, the planes that had not yet launched being swallowed by fire. The pilot's thoughts were racing. There was no time for mourning, no time to dwell on the futility that surrounded him. He focused on flying, on keeping his plane steady, on completing the mission. And yet, even as he maneuvered to avoid falling debris, a gnawing realization took hold. The tide had irrevocably turned against Japan. Hiryū's destruction would mark the annihilation of the carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific for nearly a year. Amid the chaos, Fuchida glimpsed the human cost in its most brutal form. Sailors, scorched and bleeding, abandoned the carrier deck and leapt into the ocean. Some struggled against waves, others vanished beneath the flames, licked the edges of oil-slicked water, sending smoke and heat upward in suffocating columns. Fuchida's stomach churned. For the first time, the war was no longer an abstract mission or strategic goal. It was a vivid tableau of human suffering and desperate courage. And then came the final, unforgettable moment. A massive explosion tore through Hiryū's magazines, sending fire and shrapnel hundreds of feet into the sky. The deck seemed to lift off the water as the carrier listed, flames racing across the remaining superstructure. Fuchida could feel the shockwave through the air, the heat brushing against his face even from hundreds of feet above. The last intact Japanese carrier was dying, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that had carried the fleet into battle. From that moment, Mitsuo Fuchida's understanding of the war shifted irreversibly. The Japanese Empire, which had seemed unstoppable after Pearl Harbor, now confronted a new, terrifying reality. Victory was no longer the balance had shifted, and the Americans were learning, adapting, surviving. The explosion of Hiryū's magazines was not just the death of a ship, it was the symbolic death of Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Fuchida banked his plane to avoid falling debris and smoke, heart hammering, eyes wide with disbelief. Around him, other pilots from his squadron were retreating, battered but alive, their planes blackened by flak and near misses. Midway Atoll, distant and indifferent, shimmered under the rising sun, a stark reminder that the fight was far from over. But the psychological victory had already shifted. In the sky above the Pacific, Fuchida knew the truth. Japan had lost its grip on the war, and there would be no turning back.
Section 5. Retreat and Reflection. The flight home, June 4th, 1942. Lieutenant Matsuo Fuchida and the surviving pilots of his squadron limped home over the vast Pacific, their B-5N Ketis trailing smoke streaks from near misses and battle damage. Below, the ocean stretched endlessly, its surface dappled with reflections of fire and debris from the shattered Japanese carriers. The roar of distant anti-aircraft fire had faded, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence that weighed on every man in the air. Fuchida's hands were steady on the control stick, but his mind was far from calm. Every turn, every adjustment in altitude, every check of the instruments reminded him of the destruction left behind. He could see the wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, once proud symbols of Japanese naval power, now burning and listing in the water. Ships were lost, aircraft destroyed, and countless men either fighting for survival or gone forever beneath the waves. The magnitude of the loss pressed down on him with a suffocating weight. The flight home was not merely a physical journey, it was a psychological one. Matsuo's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on what he had witnessed. The coordinated strikes of the Americans, the precision of their dive bombers, and the rapid adaptability of their pilots revealed a harsh truth. The Japanese carriers were no longer untouchable. Confidence and morale that had buoyed the Imperial Navy since Pearl Harbor now hung by a thread. As he traced a course back toward the remnants of the Japanese fleet, Fuchida's mind replayed each moment of the morning. The first torpedo launches, the initial successes, and then the relentless counterattacks that had crippled the fleet. Each memory was vivid and haunting. The sudden bursts of fire from Kaga, the smoke curling from Sōryū's decks, the deafening explosions on Hiryū. For the first time, he truly comprehended the scale of the defeat. The Empire's dominance in the Pacific had been shattered in mere hours. Below, some survivors clung to rafts and floating debris, eyes wide with shock and exhaustion. The ocean, calm again after the storm of battle, reflected the sinking sun, painting a surreal tableau of devastation. Matsuo thought of the men he had known, comrades who had trained, laughed and flown beside him. Many were now gone. The weight of responsibility of survival and of witnessing history pressed heavily upon him. Radio chatter was sparse. Orders were terse and hesitant. The commanders who remained were still trying to assess the scope of the disaster, to regroup what little strength remained. Fuchida's squadron, battered but intact, became a living testimony of the day's events, their planes bearing the scars of a battle that had redefined the Pacific War. As the Japanese carriers disappeared from view, swallowed by smoke and the horizon, Fuchida's thoughts turned to the broader implications. Midway had been more than a battle. It was a revelation. The myth of invincibility that had buoyed Japan's military confidence had been shattered. The Americans, once presumed weak and scattered, had demonstrated cunning, resilience, and a capacity for devastating precision. The war was no longer a series of victories assured by surprise and audacity. It had become a contest of skill, strategy, and endurance that Japan could no longer take for granted. Flying in formation, with the few remaining planes, Matsuo looked down at the Pacific expanse. The waves glimmered like shattered glass, reflecting both the morning's violence and the uncertainty of the future. In that moment, he understood with painful clarity that the Battle of Midway was not simply a tactical loss. It was a strategic turning point. The war had changed irrevocably, and Japan's path to conquest now faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Section 6. The Aftermath. Shockwaves through the Empire. June 5, 1942. Midway's dawn had faded, leaving the Japanese fleet diminished, scarred and silent. Lieutenant Matsuo Fuchida returned to the remnants of Akagi, now a ghostly silhouette of steel and fire-scorched decks. The carrier was still afloat, but only barely,
its superstructure riddled with holes, smoke curling from every deck, and the stench of burning fuel heavy in the air. Crew members moved like shadows, shell-shocked, their faces smeared with soot, eyes hollow from witnessing the annihilation of their comrades and sister ships. Fuchida disembarked onto the trembling deck, boots echoing against warped metal. Around him, officers huddled in small clusters, discussing the day's events in low, tense voices. Reports were grim. Akagi would sink by nightfall, and the remaining fleet was scattered, damaged, and demoralized. The weight of the disaster settled like a stone in Fuchida's chest. Never before had he seen Japanese naval power so completely humiliated. As he walked through the deck, he overheard fragments of conversation, accounts from pilots and sailors who had survived the firestorm of Hiryū. Some spoke in disbelief, others spoke in bitter silence. A young ensign, his face streaked with tears and ash, whispered that he had seen friends torn apart by explosions, that the sea was littered with bodies. The human toll Fuchida realized was beyond comprehension. Midway was more than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological blow to the entire empire. Back on Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, commander of the carrier strike force, sat in his cramped command room, staring at maps, dotted with symbols representing the destroyed fleet. His usually calm, disciplined expression was clouded with rare doubt. Fuchida approached, saluted, and offered a brief report. Nagamo's eyes did not leave the charts. "We were blind," he muttered. "We underestimated them, and now we have paid the price." For Fuchida, the reality of what had occurred began to crystallize. The Americans, though outnumbered and initially surprised, had exploited weaknesses in the Japanese formation, demonstrating strategic foresight and courage that Japan had not anticipated. 4 carriers lost in a single day. Kaga, Akagi, Sōryū, Hiryū, represented not just ships, but the very heart of Japanese naval power. The balance of the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The surviving pilots gathered on deck, their planes lined up, battered but intact. Matuso looked at them, friends, comrades, fellow warriors, and felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. They had survived, yet survival had come at a monumental cost. Their mission had failed in ways that would echo far beyond the immediate battle. Fuchida realized that the war he had fought with confidence and certainty was now entering a new, harsher phase. The illusion of Japanese supremacy was shattered, replaced by the dawning realization that the Americans would fight relentlessly, intelligently, and effectively. Even as the fleet prepared for retreat, the Japanese Navy grappled with a bitter truth. Midway was a turning point. Intelligence reports would later confirm the extent of the disaster, but for the men who had witnessed it firsthand, pilots like Fuchida, the understanding came instantly, brutally, and irrevocably. The war had changed. The Pacific, once a domain of Japanese dominance, now belonged to neither side. It was a contested, deadly arena, where mistakes were punished with fire and blood. Fuchida's gaze drifted over the ocean. The waves, calm and indifferent, reflected the early morning sun, glinting off the scattered wreckage of the once mighty carriers. The scene was surreal, a juxtaposition of beauty and destruction, serenity and horror. He knew that the Empire's ambitions had suffered a devastating setback, and the lessons of Midway would shape every future engagement. Courage alone was no longer enough. Strategy, intelligence, and adaptability had become the defining factors of survival and victory. As Fuchida prepared to brief the remaining pilots and crews, he silently acknowledged the truth that would haunt him and the Japanese Navy for the rest of the war. The tide had turned, and the Americans had proven that Japan could be defeated. Midway was not just a battle. It was the moment when hope turned to uncertainty, when pride was replaced by reflection, and when the unthinkable reality of defeat began to take hold.
Section 7. Personal Reckoning. Michio Fuchida's Realization. June 5, 1942. The morning light filtered weakly through the smoke, lingering over Akagi's shattered decks. Lieutenant Michio Fuchida walked slowly among the survivors, his flight suit still streaked with soot, his gloves damp from handling the damaged aircraft. The air smelled of burned fuel, salt, and something more intangible, a lingering sense of finality, as if the very ocean around Midway now carried the weight of loss. Fuchida paused beside a small group of young pilots, their faces pale, eyes hollow, hands shaking as they cleaned minor damage to their planes. He observed them quietly, understanding that courage alone could not erase the horror they had witnessed. The ships were gone, the fleet's power shattered, and the human cost beyond measure. Midway was a battlefield where statistics merged with tragedy, where every tactical decision had immediate lethal consequences. He climbed to a vantage point, overlooking the remains of the carrier formation. The water shimmered with wreckage, twisted metal, floating debris, and the occasional body of a sailor who had not survived. Fire still licked the decks of some ships, smoke curling skyward in slow, mournful columns. Fuchida swallowed hard. The loss was staggering. The Japanese Empire had suffered more than just a military setback. It had endured a profound psychological blow. For the first time, Fuchida allowed himself to contemplate what this defeat meant. 4 carriers lost in a single day. The heart of Japan's naval aviation was more than a tactical disaster. It was a signal that the strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted. The Americans were no longer a reactive force. They had struck with precision, exploiting intelligence and timing, and now held the upper hand. Michio understood that every future engagement would be fought under this new uncomfortable reality. Victory would not be automatic. Survival would require humility, adaptability, and an unflinching acknowledgement of the enemy's growing competence. Fuchida's thoughts drifted to the men he had flown with, the lives lost, and the families who would never see them again. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him, not just as a pilot, but as a witness to history. Each explosion he had seen, each carrier lost, was a turning point etched into memory, a visceral lesson that war was as much about intelligence, planning and adaptability, as it was about bravery. He glanced toward the horizon, where the morning sun sparkled on the Pacific waves, indifferent to the devastation it reflected. In that vast expanse, Fuchida sensed the enormity of what had occurred, the illusion of invincibility, the pride of a military tradition, and the confidence in Japan's destiny. All had been shattered in a single chaotic day. Midway was no longer a distant atoll. It had become a symbol, a marker of change in the war, and a testament to the rising power and resolve of the United States Navy. As he prepared to report back to the remaining commanders, Michio Fuchida felt a quiet, sobering understanding settle over him. The Imperial Navy would endure, but its supremacy was no longer guaranteed. From this day forward, every mission, every strike, every engagement would be shadowed by the lessons of Midway. And in the depth of his mind, he realized the truth that many in Japan would struggle to accept. The war had turned, and the outcome was no longer certain. Fuchida took a deep breath, letting the salty wind carry away the immediate haze of smoke and fire. He squared his shoulders, steeling himself for the grim reports and difficult decisions ahead. The human cost, the strategic ramifications, and the bitter awareness of defeat all weighed heavily upon him. But in that crucible, he also found clarity. Midway had reshaped the Pacific War, and he, like every survivor of that day, would carry its lessons forever. Section 8. The Ripple Effect. Japan's Strategic Collapse. June. Over the next 24 hours, reports and damage assessments filtered back to the surviving elements of the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Michio Fuchida, still airborne for reconnaissance and coordination missions, witnessed the tangible consequences of Midway unfold in real time. Akagi, heavily damaged and listing, was now unfit for further combat. Kaga, Sōryū and Hiryū, all sunk, lay beneath the Pacific waves, taking with them experienced pilots, flight crews, and the operational capacity to project Japanese naval power for months if not years. Fuchida's mind grappled with the strategic implications. Japan's carefully orchestrated plan to seize Midway and extend its defensive perimeter in the Pacific had failed catastrophically.
The loss of 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, was a blow that could not be quickly replaced. Every commander and strategist aboard the surviving ships now faced the grim task of re-evaluating operations, supply lines and morale in the aftermath of disaster. Even as he flew over the calm blue waters, Fuchida could sense the shift in tone among the remaining officers. There was no triumphalism, no exaggerated confidence. The fleet's tone was somber, reflective, and cautious. Men who had once approached battle with assured victory now moved with a haunted awareness of vulnerability. Midway had proven that the Americans were no longer an opponent to be underestimated. They were learning, adapting, and striking with deadly precision. Fuchida also noted the psychological impact on the pilots who survived the carnage. Many had seen comrades destroyed in moments of flame and steel, had watched the carriers explode beneath them, and had flown through fire-laden skies with nothing but skill and instinct to guide them. Survivors carried scars that were both visible: burned wings, twisted metal, ripped uniforms, and invisible, the weight of what they had witnessed, and the knowledge that the balance of power had shifted against them. On board Akagi, high-ranking officers convened emergency councils. Strategies for retreat and regrouping were debated with unprecedented caution. Michio observed the subtle but profound change in leadership. Once bold, even reckless, now tempered with hesitation. The men who had led the fleet with confidence were now confronting an uncomfortable truth. Japan could no longer dominate the Pacific with audacity alone. Every subsequent decision would be made under the shadow of Midway's staggering loss. Fuchida himself reflected quietly on the broader scope of the war. The Imperial Navy's aura of invincibility, long leveraged to intimidate and control, was broken. The Americans had demonstrated strategic cunning, and their resilience foreshadowed a conflict far longer and more grueling than Japan had anticipated. The loss of carriers was only the beginning. The morale of the Navy, the confidence of pilots, and the perception of Japan's invulnerability had all been shattered. High above the fleet, Michio Fuchida realized a critical, painful truth. Midway was not just a tactical defeat, but a turning point in the Pacific War. The battle had shifted initiative, exposed weaknesses in Japanese planning, and illustrated that sheer audacity could no longer guarantee victory. The Empire's ambitions were now constrained by a harsher reality, and the lessons of that day would reverberate through every theater of war in the Pacific. As Fuchida descended toward the damaged Akagi for landing, he felt a mixture of relief and unease. The sky was clear, the waters below calm, but the shadow of Midway loomed large. Every survivor would carry the memory, every commander would recalibrate, and every decision from this day forward would be informed by the painful, undeniable lessons of June 4th. The tide had turned. The Pacific War had changed forever.
Section 9. Voices of Survivors, bearing witness to history. June 7th, 1942. The surviving pilots and sailors of the Japanese fleet began to gather their thoughts and recount the day's events. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida, now on the deck of Akagi, moved among the men, listening as voices trembled between disbelief, grief, and the reluctant acknowledgement of reality. Every story carried the same raw intensity: the deafening explosions, the rising columns of smoke, the sight of comrades engulfed in flames or swallowed by the sea. A young pilot, barely 19, spoke haltingly of Hiryū's destruction. "I saw it explode from above," he stammered. "Flames, so high, men falling." His hands shook violently as he clenched them over the controls he had never fully released since landing. Fuchida placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder, understanding that no words could erase the horrors witnessed. They had seen the might of the Imperial Navy crumbled in hours, and the psychological weight was almost unbearable. Other survivors recalled the courage of men who acted against all odds: deck crews who fought flames without hesitation, pilots who pressed on to strike despite overwhelming anti-aircraft fire, and commanders who made impossible decisions under impossible pressure. These stories were not just accounts of bravery. They were testament to the human cost of strategic failure. Midway had stripped away pride, illusion, and certainty, leaving raw truth in its place. Fuchida, listening quietly, reflected on the dichotomy of human experience in warfare:
the exhilaration of the attack, the fear of death, and the slow creeping realization that the Empire's dominance had been broken. Each voice carried weight, each narrative a fragment of the larger catastrophe that had unfolded in mere hours. They were living witnesses to a moment that would be etched into history, a moment that would define the Pacific theater for years to come. As word spread through the fleet, a collective understanding emerged. The Battle of Midway was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a turning point. The Americans had struck with precision, intelligence, and timing, exposing the vulnerabilities of Japan's carrier-based strategy. 4 carriers destroyed, seasoned crews lost, the offensive initiative squandered, all were undeniable indicators that Japan's path to Pacific domination had been irrevocably altered. Fuchida walked the decks in silence, observing the men as they struggled to reconcile the events with their training, their pride and their expectations. Some stared blankly at the horizon, as if searching for answers in the distant way. Others spoke in hushed tones of the ships they had lost, the friends who would never return, and the lessons learned too late. The human cost of Midway was staggering, and the psychological toll on the Navy would resonate for months, shaping strategy, morale, and the conduct of war. For Mitsuo Fuchida, the day's events crystallized into a single, unavoidable truth. The war had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Americans. The Empire's confidence, its aura of invincibility, had been shattered, and every future engagement would now be conducted under this harsh reality. Midway was more than a battle. It was a revelation, a moment when the Japanese Navy confronted the limits of its power and the resilience of its enemy. As the sun set over the calm Pacific, Fuchida stood on Akagi's deck, gazing at the remnants of the once mighty fleet. Smoke still rose from the burning carriers, a somber monument to what had been lost. In the distance, the waves lapped gently against the waterlogged remains of ships and debris, indifferent to the tragedy above. Mitsuo understood, with painful clarity, that this was the beginning of a new phase of the war, a phase in which victory would be uncertain, hard-won, and fraught with peril. Section 10. The Moment of Truth. Fuchida's Epiphany. June. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida sat alone in the quiet of Akagi's bridge, the chaos of battle behind him, the smoke of destruction still faintly lingering in the morning. His flight suit was scorched and streaked, his hands still tingling from gripping the control stick through maneuvers that had felt like a dance with death. Around him, the surviving fleet moved slowly, a shadow of its former power, each ship bearing the scars of Midway's inferno. Fuchida's eyes traced the horizon, where calm waves reflected the rising sun. For the first time since leaving the deck hours earlier, he allowed himself to reflect fully on what he had witnessed. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū and Hiryū was not just the loss of ships, it was the obliteration of the Imperial Navy's strategic core, the heart of Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The psychological weight of that reality pressed down on him, heavier than any aircraft, heavier than the burning decks below. Memories of the morning replayed in vivid detail, the deafening roar of anti-aircraft fire, the brilliant columns of smoke, the terrified faces of comrades, the flash of explosions that turned ships into pyre. Every sense was etched into his mind, the smell of burned fuel, the heat of the flames, the weightless moment when a plane dropped too close to a detonating bomb. Fuchida understood now what the survivors had whispered in stunned tones. The war had changed forever. He thought of the young pilots who had followed him into the sky, full of confidence and skill, now forever altered by what they had seen. He thought of Admiral Nagumo, whose calm command had been replaced by a haunted uncertainty, and he thought of the Americans resilient, adaptive, and capable of striking with precision, that had turned the tide in a single devastating engagement. Midway had proven that audacity alone could no longer secure victory. Strategy, intelligence, and relentless courage were the new arbiters of war. A heavy silence filled the bridge. Mitsuo felt the truth settle in his chest like a stone. For years the Japanese Navy had carried itself with the certainty of supremacy, a belief strengthened by early victories across the Pacific. But in those hours over Midway, that belief had been shattered. He realized with a mixture of sorrow and clarity that the balance of the Pacific had irrevocably shifted. Japan would no longer hold the initiative. It would be forced to react, adapt and struggle against an enemy that had proven capable of anticipating and countering its moves. Fuchida exhaled slowly, the salt air mixing with the lingering smoke. He felt an almost overwhelming sense of humility. Courage, skill, and discipline had kept him alive, but they could not undo the reality of defeat. Midway was more than a lost battle. It was the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. Japan's path to domination had been blocked, and the Americans had seized the first decisive advantage in the Pacific War. He rose from his seat and walked to the edge of the bridge, staring at the shattered fleet. Below, survivors clung to rafts, salvaged supplies and the remnants of their honor. Mitsuo Fuchida understood, finally and fully, that this was the moment every pilot, sailor and officer would carry with them, the moment they realized the war had turned. It was a lesson written in fire, smoke, and water, a truth witnessed from the cockpit, the deck, and the way. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the wreckage of the once mighty carriers, Fuchida felt the weight of history settle over him. He had seen the future of the Pacific, and it was no longer a path paved by Japanese dominance. The Battle of Midway had not just destroyed ships, it had destroyed the illusion of invincibility, replaced by the stark, unyielding reality that the Americans could and would fight back. For Mitsuo Fuchida, the vision was searing and unforgettable. The horizon lined with burning ships, the cries of men carried on the wind, and the realization that the tide had turned irreversibly. In that instant, he understood that the war was no longer a confident march forward. It was a struggle against a rising power that had proven it could withstand, adapt, and strike back with lethal precision. Midway had become the fulcrum upon which the fate of the Pacific now balanced.